The night my own son told me to leave the house I built with my own hands, I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't remind him of the years I spent sacrificing everything so he could stand where he was standing. Because in that moment I realized something far more important than winning an argument. I realized that the person in front of me no longer saw me as a father, only as an obstacle, and once that shift happens, once respect turns into entitlement, there is nothing left to fix. Only something left to reveal, and what he didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly imagined, was that the moment he asked me to walk out that door, he wasn't removing me from his life. He was triggering something I had quietly prepared for years. Something that would change. Everything he thought he owned, everything he believed was secure, and everything he assumed I would never take back. It didn't happen overnight, this shift in him. It was gradual, almost invisible at first, like small cracks forming in something that once felt solid. And I noticed it long before he did, the way his tone changed, the way appreciation slowly turned into expectation, and expectation into entitlement. And while most people ignore those changes, hoping they'll correct themselves, I didn't, because I've seen what happens when small shifts are left unchecked. They grow, they evolve, and eventually they reshape the entire dynamic without anyone realizing it until it's too late. And that's why I started paying attention. Not reacting, not confronting, just observing, because observation gives you something reactions never can, clarity. At first, it was subtle things, decisions being made without including me, conversations that used to involve respect turning into statements that assumed authority, and while none of it was dramatic on its own together, they painted a very clear picture. One that most people would ignore because it's uncomfortable to accept. But I didn't have that luxury because I understood something he didn't. I understood that control doesn't disappear suddenly. It's slowly taken piece by piece. Until one day you realize you're no longer part of the structure you built. You're just existing inside something that now belongs to someone else. And that's when I made a decision. Not out of anger, not out of fear, but out of understanding. I decided that if things were moving in that direction, I wouldn't wait until I was forced out without options. I would prepare quietly, carefully, in a way that didn't disrupt anything on the surface, because preparation done in silence is always more powerful than reaction done in emotion, and over time, while everything around me appeared normal. While he continued stepping into what he believed was control, I was building something else entirely, something he would only discover when it was already too late to change it. The house itself was never just a place to live. It was a symbol, not of wealth, but of years of effort, of decisions made when things were uncertain, and that's what made the situation different, because he didn't see it that way anymore. To him, it had become something expected, something inherited before its time, and that shift in perception is dangerous. Because once someone believes something is already theirs, they stop respecting what it took to build it, and that lack of respect always leads to one thing, overconfidence, and overconfidence is where people make their biggest mistakes. What he didn't realize was that while he was growing more comfortable, more certain that everything around him was fixed, I was doing the opposite. I was questioning everything, reviewing everything, making sure that nothing was left vulnerable. Because structures that rely only on trust without verification don't last. They collapse under pressure, and I wasn't willing to let that happen, not after everything it took to get there. And that's why every step I took was intentional, not visible, not dramatic, but precise. Designed to ensure that no matter what happened, I would never be left without control over what I built. The day he finally said it, the day he told me I should leave, didn't feel shocking. It felt expected, almost inevitable, because by then everything had already pointed toward that outcome. The tone, the distance, the confidence in his voice that suggested he believed he had the authority to make that decision, and in a way that was the most revealing part, not what he said, but how certain he was that he could say it without consequence. Because that certainty only exists when someone believes there are no variables left, no unknown factors that could change the outcome. And that's where he was wrong, because while he thought everything was already decided, he had no idea that the most important part of the situation had never been visible to him. It had been developing quietly in the background, structured in a way that didn't require confrontation. didn't require warning, only timing, and timing is everything in situations like this, because the right move at the wrong time changes nothing, but the right move at the right time changes everything. So when I stood up that night, when I walked toward the door without arguing, without trying to convince him to reconsider it, wasn't because I was giving up, it was because I understood something he didn't yet understand, that power doesn't always show itself in resistance. Sometimes it reveals itself in patience, in the ability to step back at the exact moment someone else believes they've stepped forward, because that illusion of control is what sets the stage for everything that comes next. And as I walked out of that house, the same house he believed was now fully his, I didn't feel loss, I didn't feel anger. I felt something far more certain than either of those emotions. I felt clarity because I knew something he didn't, something he would only realize later when everything around him started to shift in ways he couldn't explain, because that night wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something he wasn't prepared, for something that had been waiting quietly for the exact moment he believed he had already won. The first night away from the house wasn't difficult in the way most people would expect, because discomfort wasn't something new to me. I had lived through years where uncertainty was normal and stability had to be built from nothing, so being outside of that house didn't feel like losing ground. It felt like stepping into a position I already understood, a position where clarity replaces comfort and observation replaces assumption. And as I sat there in a quiet room far removed from everything he believed he now controlled, I didn't think about what I had left behind. I thought about what was already in motion, because what he saw as a final action I understood as a trigger, something that would activate a sequence of events he had never even considered as a possibility. The structure I had built over the years wasn't fragile. It didn't depend on a single location or a single decision to remain intact. It was layered, distributed in a way that ensured no single point of failure could ever dismantle it completely. And that's the difference between something that looks strong and something that actually is, because real strength isn't visible on the surface. It exists in how well something holds under pressure. And while he believed the house represented control, I knew better. I knew that control had never been tied to walls or ownership in the way he imagined it was tied to something far less visible and far more permanent. By the second day, subtle shifts had already begun. Not dramatic enough to draw immediate attention, but consistent enough to indicate that the system was responding exactly as it was designed to. Because when something is built correctly, it doesn't require constant adjustment. It moves on its own once activated. And that's what made the situation irreversible, because once certain processes begin, they don't pause for reconsideration. They don't wait for emotions to settle. They continue forward, guided only by the structure that was put in place long before anyone realized it would be needed. Meanwhile, he was still operating under the assumption that everything remained exactly as it had been the night before, that nothing had changed beyond my physical absence, and that assumption is what gave him a sense of confidence, a temporary stability that often comes before a shift. Because when someone believes they fully understand their situation, they stop questioning it. They stop checking for inconsistencies, and that's when the first cracks begin to form unnoticed, not because they're hidden, but because no one is looking for them. The call started quietly. Not directly to him at first, but within the network he relied on small confirmations, minor verifications, requests that seemed routine on the surface but carried a deeper purpose. And that's how systems like this work. They don't announce themselves, they integrate. They move through channels that appear normal until they begin to accumulate into something that can no longer be ignored, and by the time those patterns become visible, the process is already too far along to be reversed. It didn't take long before those subtle movements reached him at first as confusion, small things not aligning the way they should, responses that didn't match expectations, delays where there had never been delays before, and while none of it pointed to a clear problem individually, together they created a sense that something was off, something wasn't functioning the way it always had, and that feeling, that lack of clarity, is often the first sign that control is beginning to shift, not suddenly but steadily, in a direction that can't yet be fully seen. His reaction, as expected, wasn't immediate concern. It was dismissal, the belief that these were temporary issues, minor disruptions that would resolve themselves without requiring deeper attention, and that response is common. Because accepting that something fundamental has changed requires a level of awareness most people don't reach until it's unavoidable, and by the time it becomes unavoidable, the window for simple solutions has already closed. What he didn't understand was that every system has a threshold, a point where minor inconsistencies begin to connect, forming a pattern that reveals the larger structure behind them, and once that threshold is crossed, everything becomes clear at once, not gradually but instantly, and that moment, the moment of realization, is always more impactful than the process that leads up to it, because it forces someone to confront the full scope of what's happening all at once. And while he was still moving through that early stage, still interpreting everything as isolated incidents, I was already aware of where it would lead. Because I had seen the entire structure from the beginning, I knew how each piece connected, how each step would unfold once activated, and that's the advantage of preparation. It removes uncertainty, it replaces reaction with certainty, and in situations like this, certainty is what determines who maintains control and who loses it. By the time the first real question formed in his mind, the first moment where he stopped dismissing the changes and started considering that something deeper might be happening, the process had already moved beyond the point where it could be stopped with a single action or a single decision, because what had been set in motion wasn't designed to be interrupted. It was designed to complete, and completion, once begun under the right conditions, is inevitable. By the time he started paying real attention, the pattern was already too consistent to ignore, because what began as isolated irregularities had evolved into something structured, something that repeated itself across different areas in ways that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. And that's when the shift began inside him, not outwardly at first, not in a way anyone else would immediately notice, but internally, where certainty starts to weaken and questions begin to replace assumptions, because once the idea forms that something might be wrong at a deeper level, it becomes impossible to fully return to the comfort of believing everything is still under control. He began retracing his steps, then reviewing recent decisions, conversations and interactions, trying to identify where things might have started to change. But the problem with that approach is that it assumes the cause exists within the visible timeline, within the moments he remembers being part of, and in this case it didn't, because what he was experiencing wasn't the result of something recent. It was the activation of something that had been structured long before he ever considered the possibility that he might not be in control. And that disconnect between cause and awareness is what made it so difficult for him to understand what was happening. The first real sign of pressure came when something he expected to happen without resistance, didn't a process that had always moved smoothly, suddenly required confirmation, verification, additional steps that had never been necessary before. And while that might seem minor to someone outside the situation, to him it was significant, because consistency is what builds confidence, and once that consistency is broken even slightly, it introduces doubt, and doubt, once introduced, spreads quickly, affecting not just one area, but every assumption connected to it. He started asking questions, then not broadly at first, but selectively testing the edges of the system to see where it still responded as expected and where it didn't, and that's when the pattern became clearer. Because the inconsistencies weren't random, they were precise, appearing in specific areas, while leaving others untouched, and that precision is what made it impossible to ignore, because random problems can be dismissed, but structured ones point to intent, to design, to something operating beneath the surface that isn't visible until you know where to look. That realization didn't bring clarity immediately. It brought tension, because understanding that something is wrong is very different from understanding what exactly is causing it, and that gap between awareness and explanation is where uncertainty becomes most intense. Because the mind tries to fill it, to create answers that restore a sense of control, but when none of those answers fully align with the evidence, the uncertainty remains growing stronger with each failed attempt to resolve it. At some point the thought crossed his mind. The possibility that I might still be connected to what was happening, but it didn't stay there long, because from his perspective, I had already been removed from the situation physically and mentally, and that's what made it easy for him to dismiss that idea. Because people tend to associate influence with presence, they believe that once someone is no longer visible, their impact disappears with them, and that assumption is often what leads to the biggest miscalculations. The pressure continued to build, not in a way that forced immediate action, but in a way that made inaction increasingly uncomfortable, because each new inconsistency added to the previous ones, forming a pattern that demanded attention, and eventually ignoring it became more difficult than confronting it, and that's when the shift fully occurred. When he moved from passive observation to active investigation, trying to uncover something that had never been meant to be obvious. But investigation without the right perspective rarely leads to the truth. It leads to fragments, partial insights that don't connect in a meaningful way. And that's exactly what he encountered, pieces of information that hinted at something larger but didn't reveal it completely, because the structure behind it wasn't designed to be understood from within. It was designed to operate independently of his awareness. And that separation is what kept him searching without finding. Meanwhile, everything continued moving forward, unaffected by his attempts to understand it, because systems like this don't pause for recognition. They don't adjust based on whether someone has figured them out or not. They follow their path until they reach completion, and that inevitability is what makes them so effective, because by the time someone realizes what's happening, the outcome is already in place. And as that realization slowly began to form, as the possibility that this wasn't accidental but intentional started to take shape in his mind, the situation shifted once again, not externally but internally, because once intention is recognized, everything changes, every action, every detail is reinterpreted through a new lens. And that lens doesn't just show what is happening. It forces the question of why, and in this case that question would lead him directly to something he had never expected to face. By the time the idea of intention fully settled into his mind, the situation stopped feeling like a series of problems and started feeling like a pattern, something designed rather than accidental, and that realization alone was enough to shift his entire approach, because once you suspect design, you stop looking for errors and start looking for structure. For connections, for something that explains why everything is happening the way it is, and that shift is where the real pressure begins, because structure implies control, and control implies that someone else is still influencing the outcome. He went deeper then, beyond surface-level checks, beyond simple confirmations into areas he had never needed to question before, and that's where the first real resistance appeared, not obvious, not direct, but present enough to slow him down, to force him to look twice at things that had always been straightforward, and that resistance wasn't random. It was placed embedded within the system in a way that only became visible once someone tried to push past the level they were expected to operate at. The more he searched, the more he realized that access didn't equal control. That having authority in name didn't necessarily mean having full influence over outcomes, and that contradiction is what unsettled him the most, because it challenged the foundation of what he believed he had gained. The idea that stepping into a position automatically granted full command over everything connected to it, and once that belief starts to break everything built on top of it, begins to feel unstable. It was around this point that the first undeniable piece of evidence surfaced, not something dramatic on its own, but something that didn't fit into any explanation he had created so far, a detail that pointed beyond the system he thought he understood, and toward something older. Something established before he ever took the position he now held, and that's when the possibility he had dismissed earlier began to return stronger, this time harder to ignore, because now it wasn't just a thought, it was supported by something real. He hesitated then. Not because he didn't want to continue, but because continuing meant confronting something he wasn't ready to fully accept, the idea that everything he believed he had taken control of might never have truly been his to control in the first place, and that hesitation is important. Because it marks the moment where certainty begins to collapse, where confidence is replaced by something else, something less stable, less predictable, something that forces a person to question not just the situation, but their own understanding of it. But curiosity, especially when mixed with pressure, doesn't allow for long pauses, and eventually he moved forward, following the trail that had begun to form connecting pieces that once seemed unrelated, and with each connection the structure became clearer, not fully visible yet, but defined enough to show that everything happening now was linked to something that had been set in place long before he ever realized it would matter. And then it happened, the moment where everything shifted from suspicion to certainty, where the pattern became undeniable, where the pieces aligned in a way that could no longer be explained away, and in that moment the realization wasn't gradual, it was immediate. Because when enough evidence connects at once, the mind doesn't need time to process it. It understands instantly. And that understanding carries a weight that's impossible to ignore. The name that appeared wasn't new to him, it was mine. Not in a way he expected, not in a way that suggested presence, but in a way that showed foundation, that revealed connection, that linked everything back to something he had already removed from the equation. And that's what made it so unsettling, because it meant that the one variable he believed was gone had never actually left it, had simply been operating in a different way, in a way he had never considered. That realization didn't just change how he saw the situation, it changed how he saw everything leading up to it, every decision, every assumption, every moment where he believed he was stepping forward independently, now recontextualized through a different lens. One where his actions weren't as isolated as he thought, where the system he believed he was controlling had always contained something beyond his reach. And as that understanding settled in, as the full implication of that connection began to take shape, one thing became clear to him in a way it never had before, that this wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't a failure of the system. It was the system working exactly as it was designed to, and the only difference now was that he had finally reached the point where he could see it. Once my name appeared within that structure, not as a surface-level reference, but as something embedded deeper, something foundational, the situation transformed completely in his mind, because it forced him to confront a reality he had actively dismissed. That my influence had never been tied to presence, that removing me from the house hadn't removed me from the system, and that realization didn't arrive comfortably. It arrived with a kind of pressure that comes from understanding too much too quickly, because once you see the foundation of something, you can't go back to believing in the version you had before. He started digging further, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of necessity, because the idea that I was still connected meant there was more he hadn't seen, more that could affect him in ways he couldn't predict. And that uncertainty drove him deeper into the structure, past the level he had been operating at, into areas that weren't designed for him to navigate easily, and the deeper he went, the clearer it became that what he had been managing was only a surface layer, something functional but not definitive. The connections he began to uncover weren't isolated. They were consistent, forming a network that pointed back to decisions made long before he ever stepped into control, and that's what made it undeniable, because coincidence doesn't repeat with precision. It doesn't create patterns that hold across different areas, and once he recognized that consistency, the idea that this was accidental disappeared, completely replaced by something far more unsettling, the understanding that everything had been designed with intention. And then came the realization that shifted everything from confusion to clarity, the discovery that what he believed to be ownership was actually layered beneath something else, something that defined it, something that determined its limits, and that's when the structure fully revealed itself. Not gradually, not in fragments, but as a complete system where every part connected back to a central point, and that point wasn't him. It had never been him. At that moment, the idea of control changed for him entirely, because control isn't about what you can access. It's about what you can't be removed from, and what he was seeing now showed him that his position, his authority, everything he believed he had secured existed within boundaries he had never questioned, boundaries that had been established long before he thought to look for them. And that's when the number surfaced, not in a dramatic reveal, not announced in a way that demanded attention, but present, consistent, across multiple layers connected to structures he had just begun to understand, and as he followed that number, as he traced it through the system, Its meaning became clearer, more defined, until there was no doubt left about what it represented. 12 million. Not theoretical, not projected, not something that might exist under certain conditions, but real, structured, secured in a way that didn't rely on his approval, his awareness, or his control. And that's what made it so impactful, because it wasn't just the amount, it was what the amount represented, years of preparation, decisions made with foresight, a level of planning that extended far beyond anything he had considered necessary. And the most unsettling part, it wasn't just that the 12 million existed, it was that it had already been moved. Not recently, not in response to being asked to leave, but earlier positioned exactly where it needed to be, long before the situation reached this point, and that timing is what changed everything. Because it proved that this wasn't a reaction. It was a plan, something that had been waiting for the exact moment it was now being revealed. That realization didn't just affect how he saw the present, it reshaped the past, every assumption he had made about how things worked. Every belief he had about his position now redefined by the understanding that there was always another layer beneath it, something he had never accessed, never questioned, because he never thought it was necessary. And as everything aligned as the full scope of what had been done, what had been prepared and what had now been activated became clear. One truth stood out above everything else, undeniable, complete and impossible to ignore, that the moment he thought he had taken everything was the exact moment he lost what mattered most. By the time the full picture settled into his mind, the situation was no longer abstract. It wasn't something he could analyze from a distance or interpret in fragments. It had become immediate, personal, something that directly affected his position, his assumptions, and the control he believed he had secured. And that shift from external observation to internal impact is where the real weight begins, because once something affects you directly, it can no longer be dismissed, delayed, or reinterpreted in a way that maintains comfort. It demands acknowledgement in its exact form. His first reaction wasn't anger, it was disbelief, not the kind that rejects reality completely, but the kind that tries to reshape it into something more manageable, something that fits within the boundaries of what he thought was possible. Because the idea that everything had been structured this way, that the foundation he stood on wasn't entirely his, required him to accept that his understanding had been incomplete from the beginning. And that's not an easy realization to hold on to without resistance. But disbelief doesn't last long when it's confronted with consistency, and the more he reviewed what he had found, the more the same pattern appeared reinforcing itself in ways that left no room for alternative explanations, and that's when disbelief started to fade, replaced by something heavier. Something more difficult to manage, because once denial is no longer possible, what comes next isn't clarity, it's pressure. The kind that builds when you realize the situation is exactly what it appears to be. He tried to act then to regain some level of control, to make adjustments that could stabilize things. But every action he took was limited by the same boundaries he had just discovered, because you can't override a structure you don't fully control, and that's what made his efforts ineffective. Not because he lacked ability, but because he lacked access to the level where real change could happen, and that limitation became clearer with each attempt. The realization of limitation is one of the most difficult things to process, especially when it follows a period of confidence, because it creates a contrast that's impossible to ignore, a gap between what you believed you could do and what you can actually influence. And that gap doesn't just affect your actions, it affects your perception of yourself, forcing you to question not just the situation, but your role within it. At some point the focus shifted away from the system and back to me, not as a distant factor, but as the central point of everything he had uncovered, because once all the connections led back to the same source, it became impossible to separate the situation from the person behind it. And that's when the need for confrontation began to form, not out of anger alone, but out of the need for confirmation, for understanding something directly, instead of through fragments. When he finally reached out, it wasn't the same confidence that had been there the night he told me to leave. It was different, more controlled, more measured, because by then he understood that he was no longer operating from a position of certainty, and that shift in tone is significant because it reflects a deeper change. One that goes beyond the situation itself and into how a person sees their own position within it. I didn't respond immediately, not because I wanted to avoid the conversation, but because timing still mattered, because in situations like this, when everything has already been set in motion, the moment you choose to engage determines how the final pieces fall into place, and waiting even briefly allows the pressure to build just enough to make the reality undeniable by the time the conversation happens. When the conversation finally began, it wasn't loud. It wasn't filled with accusations or dramatic confrontation. It was controlled, almost quiet, because by that point neither of us needed to explain what had happened. We both understood it. The only difference was that he had just arrived at that understanding, while I had been operating within it long before he ever realized it existed. And in that moment, as everything aligned between us as the truth, no longer existed as something hidden or discovered, but simply as something present, one thing became clear in a way it never had before. That this wasn't about taking something away. It was about revealing what had always been structured to remain out of reach. And that realization carried more weight than anything else, because it couldn't be changed, only understood. By the time we reached that point, there was nothing left to uncover. No hidden detail waiting to shift the outcome. No misunderstanding left to resolve, only a complete and fully understood reality that both of us were now standing inside. And that kind of clarity changes the nature of everything, because once something is fully seen, it can no longer be reshaped into something more comfortable. It remains exactly what it is, and as he stood there facing me, no longer questioning the structure, no longer trying to find inconsistencies, it became clear that the situation had moved beyond discovery and into acceptance, even if that acceptance hadn't fully settled in yet. His questions, when they came, were no longer about whether something had happened. They were about how it had been possible, how something so significant could exist without his awareness, how the system he believed he controlled could contain something beyond his reach. And those questions weren't asked with the same tone as before. They carried weight, a recognition that the answers wouldn't change anything but still needed to be understood. Because understanding is often the only thing left when control is no longer an option. I didn't explain everything, not because there was something to hide, but because not everything needs to be broken down to be understood. Some things become clear simply through their presence, through the way they hold under pressure, through the fact that they exist exactly as they are without needing justification. And that's what this situation had become. Something complete in itself, something that didn't require explanation to maintain its structure. The emotional shift in him was visible now, not dramatic, not explosive, but steady, the kind of change that happens when someone fully realizes the position they're in, when every assumption they relied on has been replaced by something more accurate, something less comfortable, and that shift doesn't just affect how they see the situation. It affects how they see themselves within it, forcing a level of reflection that can't be avoided once it begins. And through all of it there was a silence that carried more meaning than any conversation could have, because it wasn't empty, it was filled with understanding, with the shared recognition that everything had reached its final state, that there was no version of this where things returned to how they were before, no path that led back to the assumptions that once made everything feel stable, only a forward movement shaped by what had now been revealed. For me, there was no sense of victory in that moment, no feeling of having gained something at his expense, because it was never about taking anything from him. It was about ensuring that what I had built could not be taken from me, and that distinction matters because one is driven by reaction, while the other is driven by intention, and everything that had happened up to this point had been rooted in intention, not emotion. The house, the position, the authority he believed he had secured, all of it still existed in some form, but its meaning had changed because once the foundation is revealed, everything built on top of it is seen differently, not as independent structures, but as extensions of something deeper, something that defines their limits, whether they're acknowledged or not, and that awareness changes how everything is experienced moving forward. Because the truth is, you don't lose everything when someone takes your place. You lose everything when you forget who built the place to begin with. And as the moment came to an end, not with a clear conclusion, but with a quiet understanding that nothing more needed to be said, it became clear that this was never about a single decision, not about the night he told me to leave, Not about the money, not even about control. It was about something much deeper, the difference between assuming ownership and actually holding it. Between stepping into something and truly understanding what it stands on. Because in the end, it wasn't the 12 million that changed everything. It wasn't the system. It wasn't even the truth he discovered. It was the moment he realized, I never left empty-handed.